where we seem to be right now is in a moment where people like President Donald Trump believe that they simply should be able to dictate the way the world is by virtue of who they are. Ironically, it's the kind of essentialism that they say that Black Americans and people of color are relying on, but I think it's really them. And that's sort of the way I'm thinking about our politics in this moment, because what I am seeing with things like the strikes on Iran, and with things like happened with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. today in the hearings on the Hill and so on, is the assertion of men who are accustomed to being able to dictate the terms of the world in which they live, suddenly hitting up against reality and discovering that reality is not answering to their version of the world. And what I mean by that is this. If you think about Trump's strikes on Iran over the weekend, they did not come from nowhere. So actually, the US has a very long history of nuclear involvement with Iran. It really begins after 1953, when, first of all, when the US is involved in overturning a democratically elected leader of Iran and replacing that person with the man that a lot of us knew as the Shah of Iran, because the democratically elected leader had wanted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company, or the Anglo-Iran oil company, and the British interests had more than half of the stock in that company, and they did not want that nationalization. So they get behind a coup that puts the Shah in place. And when that happens, the Shah begins to work pretty closely with the United States. And one of the things that they do is that in 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower, begins to recognize how very concerned people are about nuclear war. And he is himself, by the way, too. So he announces his program in 53 that's known as Atoms for Peace. And the idea is to switch the world's use of nuclear weapons to the idea of nuclear capabilities that are good for civilians, especially through energy. And what they do is not just the US, but a number of countries say that we will provide nuclear technologies to countries that promise to use it only for peaceful purposes. And Iran is one of the countries to which we provide both a reactor and enriched uranium in order for that to happen. But then, of course, just as the Shah is announcing that he's going to have 20 more nuclear reactors in his country, the Islamic Revolution happens. And in 1979, the US cuts ties with Iran, puts sanctions on them and cuts ties with them because I'm just doing a flyby here, because there are American hostages taken and held for 444 days in Tehran. And so with that, when the US put sanctions on Iran and cuts ties to Iran, what happens then is that the Iranians turn to Pakistan, China, and Russia to continue their nuclear program. Okay, so that's the backstory, the backstory. But from then on, the US was terribly concerned about the use of those nuclear facilities, and especially the nuclear fuel, that it would be enriched and the Iranians would use it to obtain a nuclear weapon. And so this has sort of been the backdrop from that. And in the same period, I'm talking about the 1990s and then the 2000s, the Republicans really start to flex their muscles internationally with the idea that the US can simply throw their weight around. This was the project that the Neoconservatives, as they were called, I want to say neo-Confederates, and that's not, it's neoconservatives and neocons, really are saying that the US ought to force countries, especially countries in the Middle East, for regime change. They should force them to become democratic countries. And this is, of course, how we get involved, not how we get involved in Afghanistan. We get involved in Afghanistan after 9/11, but this is how we start to support the idea of regime change in Middle Eastern countries. Anyway, if that's the idea, that we should force people to do what we will through exertion of violence, you can see that with people like John McCain, the Arizona senator, talking in 2007 about bombing Iran. Remember, bomb Iran? That was 2007. And this idea that the way to stop the construction of a nuclear weapon is through violence, is to force these people in Iran to do what we want. Well, The reason I started where I did today is that if you think about it, what happens is for all the sort of saber rattling, it's actually Barack Obama, a Democratic president, a man of color in his second term, who begins in 2013 negotiations. Not we're going to be a cowboy here, but we're really going to be the community. Remember, because the cowboy always rides off and the community then establishes the rules of law. We're going to negotiate and we're going to find a way to make sure that the Iranians don't develop a nuclear weapon. And what comes out of that in 2015 is the JCPOA, Iran nuclear deal, as it's known. And what it says is that in exchange for a number of countries, not just the US, but a number of countries lifting sanctions on Iran, they will not enrich uranium and they will destroy a lot of the enriched uranium that they have. That goes into effect in 2015. And when it does, or before it does, a number of Republican senators tried to blow up the deal. They're like, we won't necessarily do this. We might bomb you, and this isn't a good thing. They're out there really shaking their fists at Iran. But the nuclear deal worked. There really is no argument that it didn't work. The international inspectors who went in to examine the places that Iran had been developing nuclear enriched fuel said that they were abiding by the rules and so on. But Trump insisted, first falsely, that there was he had this weird story about Obama sending pallets of cash and stuff. That's not what happened. And I can tell you about it if you want to know. But he kept saying this was a terrible deal. We should never have done it. This is a terrible deal. We should never have done it. And it did, in fact, return money to Iran that had been frozen in other countries, including the US, after the Islamic Revolution. But it did achieve what we wanted it to achieve. And in 2018, Trump blew that up. He tore that agreement up. And once the US had pulled out, basically Iran said, we don't need to obey this any longer. And it began to enrich uranium again. So now, after all this time, and of course, Israel's got its own thing going on because Netanyahu recognized that fighting Iran would enable him to consolidate his very rapidly waning power in Israel. And Trump kept saying, we shouldn't go in and bomb. We shouldn't be part of Israel's attacks on Iran. But as soon as Israel started to look really good on Fox News, Trump wanted in on that deal. He wanted to be the president who had actually bombed Iran. And so he did. And it appears to have accomplished very, very, very little. But it's really interesting today, if you read, and there's no reason you should, that's what I do, right? If you read Trump's Truth Social posts today, that account has been like on fire. It's been posting constantly how brilliant Trump is, how he was always right about everything, how he's brought peace to the world, and so on and so forth. And as you know, that, or maybe you don't, last night he said at about a little after 6 o'clock, he said that Iran and Israel had agreed to a ceasefire that was going to become a permanent peace. And of course, Israel violated that within 3 hours, and then Iran retaliated. And this morning, he used profanity when he said that neither of those countries knows what the F they are doing because they've been fighting so long. And all day long, there has been this sense, to me anyway, of sort of frustration and anger on Trump's True Social account, where he's been screaming at people, alternately posting about how brilliant he is. And, it just sort of feels to me like what we are seeing is somebody who is recognizing now that negotiation is really hard. There's a reason that it took 2 years to get the JCPOA, and that was actually pretty quick compared to negotiations that sometimes drag on for years and years. And, he kept saying these Democrats are stupid. They don't know what they're doing. I can do this. These people of color, these women, they don't know what they're doing. I can just do this. And you can't. That's not actually the way the world works. And they're just this reality kind of intruding on that dominance politics to say, you can't just announce how things are going to be. That's a lovely thought until it isn't any longer. And when reality intrudes and you can't just say, well, I'm the smart one, I can handle this. When you actually are supposed to handle it, you often discover that you don't know what you're talking about. And this, by the way, is a hallmark of a narcissistic personality whose real strength comes from complaining about everybody else. They actually can't do much themselves. What they do is create chaos around themselves so that they can then step in and say, well, I would have done a better job. I'm the one who knew how to do things, and get attention and reinforcement of their own personalities that way. So in this moment, the you're seeing Trump trying to insist that he has brought peace to the Middle East. And, maybe good luck to him with that. But it might have been that it was an excuse for other people to make peace. But heavens, if all you had to do was go in and announce that everything was going to be good from now on, don't you think somebody would have tried that before? So that idea, and the thing that I'm kind of playing with, as I say, is this idea of what happens when dominance politics, when these guys recognize that they are not actually the smartest guy in the room, the guy who knows how to do stuff, that they have fired all the people who know actually how to do things. And I think you see this with Pete Hegseth at Defense Secretary, who, he keeps screaming about how good he is at push-ups. But if you read military.com, as I do, you know that people are like, we kind of liked the guy who, I don't know, got us paychecks and food and actually knew how to run things, which doesn't have a lot to do necessarily with doing push-ups. It has to do with spending a lot of time in the uniform, learning how the systems work, getting an education, reading, all those values that dominance politics and cowboy individualism has really denigrated over the last 40 years.